Hello, beautiful ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Jen Gerson, and I am here on the line with Michael Geist. He is a University of Ottawa professor and basically Canada's go-to dude on digital law and privacy issues. He and I talk about lots of things. We talk about the Americans getting upset with us about our fairly terrible digital laws. He talks a little bit about Tumblr Ridge and the desire to regulate AI chatbots through the Online Harms Act. And we talk about the dreadful hypocrisy of C4, and that's the desire by political parties to exempt themselves from privacy legislation. That's today on the Line.
This episode of On the Line is brought to you by the Forest Products Association of Canada. Government can't control the global markets, but they can control the efficiency of our own regulatory system. It's been over 150 days since the Red Tape Review, and Canada's forest products sector is ready to move from intent to outcomes. We're advocating for practical fixes, like reducing duplication and improving coordination, so we can get projects built at the speed of business. With greater regulatory efficiency, we can better compete with the Americans and Europeans, grow jobs, bring more of Canada to the world, and secure a stronger Canadian economy. Let's get to work. Visit www.fpac.ca to see more.
Hello, Professor Michael Geist. Nice to see you again. I haven't spoken to you in so long.
It's been a little while. It's nice to see you too, Jen.
Nice to see you too. So, look, I have a confession to make. Typically speaking, digital law in Canada is one of my wheelhouses, and I admit I have been completely thrown off by events over the last couple of weeks, and I feel extremely out of the loop. So I'm having you on the line mostly to help me get caught up on what I need to be paying attention to. There have been a few items on the digital file that have been in the news. There's been the Trade Priority Report. There's the Online Harms Act and where that sits, and there's been some interesting privacy provisions in C4, which I believe the Senate struck down. So I just want to start right from the top here. Let's go into it, assuming that our audience doesn't know anything about any of this stuff, and I'll try and keep it as spicy as humanly possible for them because we all know everybody loves digital law in Canada. Yes. I think the most important thing, and you mentioned it when we were just offline, and this had completely gone off my radar. The U.S. released its Trade Priority Report that focused on two specific issues. One of which was agriculture, and we will not be getting into that today. But the other one is focusing on Canada's digital laws. Michael, can you explain to me what the Americans are concerned about?
Sure. So this is part of their trade policy agenda report. So it identifies, as you say, their various priorities. And it didn't get a lot of attention, but in some ways, they're not hiding the ball here in terms of trying to identify what are the key U.S. issues with respect to Canadian trade. And of course, the context that's important for people to bear in mind here is that all of this comes within the broader framing of the renegotiation of the USMCA or CUSMA, which is scheduled to start this year. And there are, of course, a lot of questions as to whether or not that will happen, how it will happen. Mexico's really tried to push forward with that, but Canada has so far put less on the table. At least that's according to the reports we've seen. But what makes, I think, this interesting and somewhat surprising that people haven't paid much attention is that within that context of looking at CUSMA, the U.S. identifies just two issues with the United States. One is agriculture related, as you mentioned, dairy in particular. But the other one is concerns, the U.S. says, about what they describe as discriminatory and restrictive digital measures, including the Online Streaming Act.
Okay,
and of course, yep.
Can we just explain to our audience exactly what the Online Streaming Act, again, for people who have not been completely on the ball with Canadian digital reality?
Yeah, no, of course. And so the Online Streaming Act that some might remember as Bill C-11 back when it was the subject of a considerable amount of debate was part of a trio of attempts that the government had under Justin Trudeau to invoke new kinds of digital regulation. There was the Online News Act that, of course, led to Facebook or Meta blocking news links from its platforms. There was the Online Harms Act that we may get into a little bit later that did not pass. And then there was this Online Streaming Act. And the basic provision, or the core part of that, really envisioned the large streaming services, the Netflix and Amazons and Disneys of the world, to both pay into a system to help fund the creation of Canadian content, as well as help support what's often referred to as discoverability, help make Canadian content more prominent or discoverable on their platforms. Now, that legislation passed. It is currently before the CRTC. It is taking a long time at the CRTC being the broadcast and telecom regulator that now is effectively an internet regulator when it comes to these issues as well. And so the CRTC is taking a long time to flesh out precisely how much they're going to be required to pay. Some of the streaming services have in the meantime challenged some of this law altogether at the courts. The federal court has been taking quite a long time to come up with its decision. So it's possible we could have the court strike it down. It's possible that the CRTC could come up with some reasonable number, or that the streamers say, hey, no big deal, we'll cut the check. Neither of those things seem particularly likely, though. And so the U.S. has become increasingly vocal about the prospect of pushing back on this and presumably demanding that Canada rescind that legislation as part of any sort of new trade deal with the U.S. and Mexico.
And did they name the C-18, the Online News Act as well specifically, or was just the Streaming Act?
They don't. Well, what they do say, just to give that specific quote, they refer to discriminatory and restrictive digital measures.
Okay.
The law that they specifically cite is the Online Streaming Act, but it is not. But it is framed in a sufficiently broad manner that you could envision them talking about some of the other laws as well, particularly what was once Bill C-18, that Online News Act.
So, Michael, I've got a bit of a problem here, and that is, on one hand, I'm not best pleased with America at present. And on the other hand, all the things that America hates, I also hate. So this puts me in a real bind. Can we explain? I mean, I think you've been on the front lines with C-11. I was very much on the front lines on C-18. I think both of us have testified at House and committee against these laws, suggesting that they were extremely problematic and more likely to cause more problems than they were certain to solve. I mean, I certainly think that prediction proved to be prescient with C-18. C-11's a bit messier, though. Can we explain a little bit about why we hated C-11 again?
Yeah, so the focus back then was primarily on sort of some of the discoverability pieces. So this notion that the platforms would be required to tinker with their algorithms or otherwise engage in different kinds of activities to make certain content prominent. And at the time, one of the real concerns was this legislation also incorporated social media content. At first it was out, then it was back in. The government said it wasn't really interested in regulating social media content, whether that's podcasts like this or other sorts of YouTube type activities or TikTok, all the range of different things that individual creators can make and post. Government said it weren't really interested in this, but they left it open as a potential source of regulation. The government, once it passed, included that possibility, but then they instructed the CRTC to leave it alone. At the moment, I think that issue has become less the issue, at least with respect to the United States. The bigger issue right now is just a financial one, because one of the other elements here was that they expected these streamers to pay. And the concern potentially from a consumer perspective was, well, if you demand additional payments from services that, it should be noted, already spend a lot of money in Canada for production, that is this going to actually result in new money, or are they simply going to reallocate some of their existing funds? Are they going to be eligible for the funding? And this is where I think the U.S. is particularly unhappy. So is this going to be a system where the U.S. is required, or U.S. streaming services are required to pay into a system to support others, but are themselves not eligible to apply it or make use of some of that money that feels, to use the U.S.'s word, somewhat discriminatory? If you've got laws that say everybody has to pay, but not everybody can be a beneficiary, and we're particularly going to exclude foreign entities from being potential beneficiaries. So
there's a bit of a taxation without representation energy happening there, right? Yeah.
I think that's it. So I think that's where the rubber hits the road from the U.S. perspective, is that they're out there saying, listen, if the Canadian model gets adopted broadly, there's a scenario whereby we get a lot of U.S. streaming services or other digital entities that are required to pay into foreign country systems aren't necessarily getting anything back, and there's not an unlimited pot of money. And so at the end of the day, the U.S. potentially loses out in a number of different ways.
Right. I actually hate to say this, but I think that's a legitimate point.
Oh, I do too.
Okay.
Yeah, no, of course. I think it is a legitimate point. And, I think it's one thing to say that we're going to create this so-called level playing field, which is what the government often referred to. That was sort of the line that drove much of this legislation. We need a level playing field. Canadian broadcasters pay into these systems. Why shouldn't foreign streamers pay into the systems as well? Problem is that certainly those that have been lobbying for this legislation and then the government want a level playing field in terms of money in, but don't want a level playing field in terms of money out.
Money out.
And it's a legitimate argument to say, well, listen, if you're going to require us to pay in much the same way as Canadian entities, then we should be beneficiaries in much the same way as Canadian entities.
I'm extremely upset right now because I feel like if things were not so pear-shaped between the US and Canada generally, we could be using these arguments rationally to peel back bad legislation or legislation that's just not been thought through. But because the relationship between the US and Canada is so sour right now, we're going to stick to our guns on the worst possible policies.
Yeah, well, we'll see. It's certainly possible that happens. We didn't on the digital services tax, and
True. True.
although there may be some amount of regret in hindsight about caving as quickly as Canada did on the DST. Although I also think that was generally the right thing to have done.
Yeah, but we didn't get anything out of it now, did we?
No, and so that's why there
Right?
may be some that say, "Listen, it's not. Why are we going to really replay this again?" I would say, though, that Canada's willingness to put this on the table, and I say this without, of course, any knowledge, just speculation, but Canada's willingness to put that kind of legislation on the table would presumably be a much more clear-cut quid pro quo. So in the case of the digital services tax, it was, well, we'll take this away so that you don't walk away from the negotiating table. In this instance, it is presumably going to be, we want to ensure that our steel industry or our lumber industry or our dairy industry continues to be beneficiaries of market access and other kinds of policies that we have. And so we're willing to sacrifice some of these additional revenues that might go into this cultural sector in return for the benefits there. And it may be that, government says, hey, listen, at the end of the day, you are making different kinds of contributions, or find some mechanism to address it, or perhaps just use tax dollars to say we'll pump more money into the system to make up for the perception that there's some now lost revenue that would have otherwise come from these digital laws.
Well, that's what we need, more Canada taxpayer-supported content. Look, I just really deeply resent being in a position where I'm being forced to defend the Online News Act and Canadian butter in the name of patriotism. Like, I'm really unhappy that that's the timeline that, I mean, don't get me wrong, I understand the terrible irony of it, but I'm very upset about it. So the other thing I just wanted to point out, specifically with C11, and I think you pointed this out when the debate was happening, is that it's not like the American and global streaming giants weren't investing in Canadian content before C11. In fact, we had just by virtue of private investment, we were seeing a renaissance on this file, weren't we?
No, we were seeing huge amounts invested. Canada is one of the leading countries worldwide in terms of production. It's what is referred to as foreign location service production. And it's one of these somewhat odd areas where we do see huge amounts spent, but for the purposes of some groups, they would prefer that we don't pay much attention to that at all. It drives jobs, it drives investment, but the argument is it doesn't drive the creation of what is referred to as Canadian content. And so then that gets us into this whole debate of, what exactly is Canadian content? The CRTC actually did hold some hearings on that and tried to refresh the definition a little bit in terms of expanding the scope of what might be considered Canadian. But part of that problem has long been that there are productions that have no real connection to Canada other than ticking the right boxes that get certified as Canadian, whereas there's other content that feels very Canadian in terms of the story, who authored the story, some of the people participating in that, where it was filmed, but under certain circumstances still doesn't qualify as Canadian. And that's actually a big part of that has been sort of highlighted by these large streaming services who will often be, or at least have shown a willingness to fund production in Canada that is Canadian in many respects, the storyline, the actors, the people working on the production. But the streaming services will say, hey, we're a global player. We want to have the rights, and we want to have the rights to exploit this on a global basis. And CanCon rules, Canadian content rules, have long said, well, if you want that, then you're not Canadian, notwithstanding all the other indicia that you've got.
Well, I know what will definitely fix this problem, Michael, and that's the federal government stepping in and micromanaging it more. That's always the solution to complicated, nuanced problems in the Canadian cultural industry. It's just more box ticking exercises, more taxpayer dollars, and more nuanced and detailed rules about what constitutes Canadian content. This will solve everything.
Yeah, no, the government would say, listen, we're not deciding some of this stuff. We leave it to our regulator, the CRTC, but
Great. Better yet.
But exactly. I mean, somebody would say that's not improving the situation at all. We're actually moving this into an area that feels to many even less accessible and more opaque in terms of how some of those rules are established.
I'm also going to have to really, really be upset if Donald Trump manages to overturn C-18. I'm really going to have some problems. That's just, even the thought of that is bringing up the marches for me. Michael, it's March in Alberta here, and I'm just staring into the abyss.
Yeah. Well, listen, the truth is that those package of laws that I made reference to a little bit before, was really the foundation behind much of those laws was all about making these big tech companies pay. I mean, and the government at the time, I think, saw this as both good policy and good politics. You wanted to fight with these companies. Well, now you're fighting with Donald Trump, which may still be good politics in some instances, but whether or not it's good policy in the broader scheme of things, certainly our country, but many countries seem a bit afraid to at least at a minimum, they're looking to pick their battles as opposed to fight it on everything, because you're certainly not going to win.
Well, let's look at the other side of the coin here, because we can talk about Canadian absurdity until the cows come home. There's the supply managed dairy cows, no less. But what is motivating the Trump administration to fixate on these particular files? Because, I mean, I understand they actually have a reasonably good argument for discrimination in C-18 or just the cluster F that turned out to be C-19 and C-18, and why I can't post my known news articles on my Facebook page anymore. But these aren't huge issues in the context of the American economy, right? Like whether or not Netflix has to pay a few $1 million into a CanCon fund that an independent American filmmaker can't access. Like there's an unfairness to that, but that's not actually going to be a major issue to an American economic big picture framework here. An independent filmmaker in America probably has access to radically more resources, networks, and capital than a comparable Canadian filmmaker has by virtue of the size of the respective markets. So what is the politics that you think is happening? Why do the Americans care about these issues so much? Why is Donald Trump so fixated on Canada's terrible butter?
Yeah. Well, listen, I don't know that anyone's I'm certainly not someone who's in a good position to explain some of the kinds of choices or motivations that lie behind Donald Trump. I will say that it feels like from a policy perspective, that kind of intersection between Trump and policy, there are a whole series of different policies or issues that kind of are spinning around. And on any given day, your issue might be the one that hits in terms of where the wheel stops. And, in the context of these particular issues, let's say on streaming, it's hit on a couple of occasions, right? Where all of a sudden you get a tweet or whatever they call a post on Truth Social where Donald Trump starts talking about the loss of production, film production in the United States, and that he is going to put a tariff on all foreign productions, which he has said in the past. No one quite knows exactly what that even means or how you would go about implementing it. But, he's appointed some people like Sylvester Stallone and John Voight, I believe, in the United States to be voices of the Hollywood interest. So it's an issue that clearly interests him to a certain extent, and to the extent to which some of these policies overlap with that may help explain it. Or it may just be that within the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office that represents the United States on trade-related issues, sort of they look at that Canadian landscape and they look at, well, what are some of the issues that have been irritants for some of our stakeholders and that they've raised that we think we could actually get some wins on that would then allow the president to declare victory, and perhaps this is one of them.
I'm just not loving the degree to which the Americans are paying attention to us anymore. I really like going back to being their oft ignored, pleasant, fluffy little hat. And they just forgot we existed. That was a happier place for everyone, I think, and I really wish we could move back to that. Michael, I want to talk about the Online Harms Act. Again, this is something that I started to launch in on. You started to launch in on. It was, I think, one of the final trademark pieces of legislation of the Trudeau era, and then eventually died on the order papers. Can we just go back and do a quick rehash? Online Harms Act. How do we sum that one up in as brief a period as possible? Because It's a pretty extensive piece of legislation.
It was, and I actually think in some ways the fact that it was so extensive was its undoing. And so you had the Justice Minister at the time, Marie Ferrani, who put forward this bill. This was designed to be really the biggest and most important of the three that we've been talking about. And so it took a long time. It took a long time in part because the government had floated a number of different possibilities for what it was thinking about, and they faced quite a lot of criticism. They had a minister who was supposed to lead on this, Stephen Guilbeault, back when he was at Heritage, that proved to be a sort of charitably an ineffective communicator on some of these digital issues. And so they decided to hold back. And ultimately, they brought this forward, and it was several bills in one. There was an element that dealt specifically with internet platforms and the responsibility they would have with respect to harms that would occur. And it narrowly defined the harms, frankly, to things that are by and large already included in the criminal code. So it was specific kinds of, I think, recognizable harms. And it didn't take what I think most would say is a hardline position with the platforms. It simply said, listen, you've got a duty to act responsibly when it comes to this. You can't simply do nothing. And we are going to work to identify what that might be. We're going to require you to be far more transparent. We're going to have penalties if you fail to live up to these kinds of standards. And I have to say that if it was limited just to that, I mean, of course, it would still face some criticism, but by and large, I think a lot of people were of the view that you could work with that. The mistake that was made in the context of online harms was an attempt to bring in other pieces of legislation and reform them as well. So there are criminal code provisions in there that I think a lot of people were really concerned about in terms of the prospect of criminalizing certain kinds of speech. And then there was the Human Rights Act reforms as well that I think a lot of people were worried would, especially in the current environment, get weaponized with large numbers of complaints that were going to be filed over internet-based hate and things like that. And so,
and what constitutes? I mean, we could do a complaint about Stephen Guilbeault's anti-Alberta hate crimes pretty easily under that legislation. Let's put it that way.
These are hard issues to sort through, and I mean, so some of these problems that they're real, but the government struggles with those. Fair enough.
I know. I was just joking. I was like, I know some. Oh, and as I said that, I was literally picturing my comments section, just basically like Jen Gerson's. No. I was making a joke. I was making a joke about how Stephen Guilbeault doesn't like Alberta. It's fine.
All good. But it's funny in part because the fears were that you never know what might get captured by this. So so some might take it seriously in part because some of the examples that get raised from time to time might feel just as ludicrous as, a politician criticizing or really disliked in a particular place. So the concern was this is going well beyond what you said you were going to try to do with platforms and the kind of responsibility that they should exercise. And the government, I think, woke up way, way too late, just with months left before Trudeau resigned and saying, okay, you know what, fine, we'll split the bill and we'll focus firstly on the responsibility piece, and later we can deal with some of these other issues. But by then it was far too late. And so the bill just died. And now we find ourselves back having a discussion yet again on there are real harms. We're seeing it crop up in a number of ways, and these are real harms. And the question is, well, what are we prepared to do about them?
So, is there a possibility that the Online Harms Act, as it was envisioned under Trudeau, is going to get put back on the table here? Or are they going to get a little bit smarter and start piecing some of these bits of legislation out?
Right. Well, I'm tempted to I would say this. I think that they are likely to not repeat the mistake that they made with the last online harms, and so it would surprise me if they brought back the criminal code and the Human Rights Act pieces in that legislation. But that doesn't mean they aren't going to seek to expand what they did or plan to do within the context of online harms. So they may take some away, but they may add at the same time. And part of that, and part of where we see that playing out, at least over the last little bit, has been as part in the aftermath of the Tumbler Ridge tragedy, and talk about using online harms legislation to deal with AI chatbots. So you could see that possibility of saying, okay, on the one hand, we'll slim it down in terms of dealing with responsibility, but the other hand, perhaps try to expand what we're doing in terms of who gets covered by this and some of the kinds of things that we're trying to do here.
And let's go into that a little bit more here. This is probably worth pointing out here is that in the wake of the Tumbler Ridge shooting, it was discovered not only that the RCMP had returned guns to the presumed perpetrator, Jesse Van Rootselaar, but also that it had been discovered that some very alarming content had showed up in the perpetrator's chat. I believe Chat GPT content. This content was so alarming that it was flagged for human oversight. Humans within the parent company then looked at this stuff, said, yeah, that's a little messed up, but didn't choose to report that to the RCMP at the time. This is a really, really interesting use case here because it's hard to assess whether or not the parent company of ChatGPT, is it just Chat? What is that?
OpenAI.
OpenAI, thank you. It's hard to determine whether or not OpenAI acted responsibly without knowing the actual specific content that was put into the chatbot. So was a human judgment call here appropriate or not appropriate? I don't know. But we do know in the wake of this news coming out, and I believe it was a Wall Street Journal?
Wall Street Journal.
It was a Wall Street Journal scoop that got this. It started to raise real concerns about whether or not there needs to be some regulatory process for when alarming content is flagged for government review. Michael, this raises all kinds of concerning flags for me as someone who uses ChatGPT as her personal therapist and actually finds it very useful in this regard. No, firstly, can the government get into my ChatGPT and figure out what is rooting through my noggin right now? What are the existing rules, and what concerns do we have about a more regulatory approach here?
Right. Well, okay. To the first question, there's no clear-cut rule that regulates AI chatbots any more than there is one that regulates what you put into a search bar and ask Google some of the same kinds of questions, or frankly, jot some of the same kinds of content down in a text message or email or even in a document and upload it to a cloud provider or another intermediary. The reality is that almost everything we write nowadays is digital. It is stored in the cloud, or at least traverses through cloud infrastructure and lands in the hands at different moments of different large intermediaries. The issue as to whether or not those intermediaries should actively be monitoring all of this content and looking for flags. My own view is that's both incredibly scary if we were to move in that direction. That's a level of surveillance that I don't think many would be comfortable with. And I have to say that it's not entirely clear to me what the difference is between putting something into a Google search bar and putting something into a AI chatbot and engaging in some of the discussion. In fact, now, of course, with Google, oftentimes you are engaging with a chatbot because Gemini often gives you some of the initial results as well. So I have some concerns about just generally this notion of, well, we need to regulate this kind of sort of surveillance and reporting, but it seems to me, it's not clear to me why it would just stop at an AI chatbot. You asked, though, does the government have the ability to gain access? And government or law enforcement has the ability to gain access the way they could in any other circumstance. They can get a potential court order saying, we want access to this information. It could be that in some circumstances, the intermediary, in this case, OpenAI, but it could be others, may have policies in place that they make it clear to their users that in certain circumstances, they may report some of that behavior. One of the issues that has come up in the aftermath of this is, well, as you mentioned, what's the appropriate moment to report? What are the standards that you use? And I think frankly, you can go a long way in saying, well, this ought to be way more transparent. There should be answers to these questions, and we should be able to know what those answers are.
Mm-hmm.
That, though, is not quite the same as what we've started to see come out of the government, which is to really increase the rhetoric around saying, well, no, we want a whole lot more disclosures. And that, to me, is pretty troubling. I have to say that you're right. We don't know what they knew, but it feels like from a process perspective, their process was, I must say, pretty okay. The standard that you would have for kicking someone off your platform is not the same as the standard that you would have for reporting them to the police.
Mm-hmm.
And so
that's appropriate. I think that's correct.
Of course. So people may violate the community terms or guidelines that you've established, and you say, listen, we're going to kick you out if you do that. That doesn't mean you report them to law enforcement. It just means you kick them out. And so in this case, person appears to have violated at minimum some of their standards or their terms, and so they did kick the person off the platform. That is still doesn't get us to, well, you should have reported it to the police as well. And
right,
they had a process. At the time, they felt that it was not appropriate to report. It's hard to know if that was right or wrong. At the moment, in hindsight, of course, we wish perhaps if it had made a difference, it would have been good to have reported, but they followed a process that I must say seems generally pretty reasonable, other than the fact that it's hard to know what exactly the standards are and the process is, because there's just not enough transparency here.
How much transparency is there about the warrant process at this point? Like if national security, national police force decides these 20 people are interesting to us for any kind of reason, whether or not we think they're criminal or we think that they're engaged in a national security risk or whatever, they apply for a warrant to keep an eye on what they're saying to AI, or they apply for a warrant on what they're sending out digitally. How much transparency is there over that process to make sure that privacy is being maintained and respected?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it's a process that in some circumstances is going to be by design pretty secretive, right? So in some instances, there are investigations, there may be prohibitions on disclosing the investigation as part of the order that's obtained. It might involve national security, and so it's pretty clear you're not going to be disclosing anything associated with that at all. Some people know about some of what takes place, but oftentimes there isn't a whole lot of transparency associated with it. That said, some of the larger platforms do have annual transparency reports where, at least in aggregate terms, they will disclose the number of requests they've received. They may break it down based on kind of subject matter and the like. They may talk about compliance. How many times did they disclose? How many court orders did they receive? So we do get some amount of information associated with this. It may not be an issue that we have time to talk about today, but the government's lawful access rules would be another digital issue that will at some point in time come back. It was included, or I guess technically still is included, in Bill C-2, which is not going forward. They moved the border issues into a different bill, Bill C-12. But one of the real concerns there was that the government was expanding this vision of law enforcement being able to demand this kind of access to well beyond just communications players and other intermediaries, to anyone who provides a service. And one of the things that I pointed out as part of that was that one of the effects would be that you would lose the effectiveness of the transparency reporting that we do have. So as long as these requests are going to wireless providers like Bell and Telus and Rogers are going to Google or Meta, then you're going to get some kind of transparency reports, at least in aggregate. But if now we're starting to cover hotels or car rental companies or whomever, they're not going to put out transparency reports, and suddenly many of the requests are going to be lost altogether.
That's interesting. Okay, so how concerned do I have to be about this? Just as a journalist, normal person, how much concern do I have to have about my privacy online as a Canadian?
Well, I think we have a lot of things that we need to be concerned with when it comes to privacy, both the inadequacy of some of our privacy rules as well as some of the proposals the government has put forward, at least with respect to privacy and political parties.
We're going to get into that in just a minute. But
which that would be good. We can get into that too, because it's another one that's been under the radar a little bit. On this issue, I think there is reason for concern generally in terms of where does the government land sort of the AI regulation plane, which is become a bigger and bigger vehicle, so to speak, as it sort of now incorporates online harms, as we've just been talking about. It incorporates a lot of economic policy in terms of an innovation policy from an AI perspective. It certainly includes data governance and privacy there as well. And it's not clear how we're going to sort through all of these issues, but tragedies like Tumbler Ridge can have the effect of driving politicians to move in a particular direction, for people to say this is horrible, so we need to do something. And sometimes that can lead to some pretty bad policy. And I do have some concerns that what we've seen so far some of it feels just a bit performative in terms of politicians meeting with, demanding that they meet with the executives and talking about the demands that they'll make of those executives. And so that sort of stuff just feels like performance. But at the end of the day, and I wrote this in a piece that I did on all this, the minister responsible for AI shouldn't need a meeting with corporate executives to understand what their standards are when it comes to these kinds of issues. So there is a real problem here. My concern is the government is going to focus not on fixes, though, at least with those problems, and turn their attention to other kinds of issues that will themselves raise some real issues and concerns.
You're saying that the government might focus more on optics than on effective policy and governance, perhaps in line with their respective stakeholders' desires and interests?
They just might.
Great. Michael, I want to talk a little bit about Bill C4. This one is also very much under the radar, but is interesting. Can you explain it for us?
Sure. So Bill C4 is ostensibly just a bill that deals with some taxation policy. It's the title the government used for it, I think, is sort of Government Affordability Measures Act or something like that. So there's a whole series of tax-related issues in there. And then buried at the very end of the bill, this is a bill in 4 parts, and the very last part, part 4, involves political party privacy. So in this instance,
that makes perfect sense to me. Let's absolutely put some provisions about political party privacy in a taxation bill. Nothing about that is suspect at all.
Yeah, not at all. And you might want to know that as they were putting this out, and you'll recall this legislation, along with some of that early legislation, came, right after Carney was elected last June. So there was this sense that the government said, well, we've got to expedite a whole series of bills because the U.S. threat requires us to pass a whole bunch of stuff. And so this was one of those bills, and they said, hey, we need to do these affordability measures. We're going to rush through this legislation. Now, as it happens, there is a case right now in British Columbia that involves political party privacy. And wouldn't you know, part 4 would have the effect, at least in the government's view, of voiding that case. Government lost the case at the trial level. It's now before the BC Court of Appeal. And so the goal of this legislation, at least in part, is to try to short circuit that case altogether. And one of the reasons that we know that, and this, I must admit, every time I mention it, I still can't really believe it, is that not only have they in part 4 given pretty close to carte blanche to political parties in terms of what they do with our personal information. So the standards that they would set for any private sector organization in Canada are nowhere near what they are setting for political parties. But they, in the legislation, say that this is retroactive to the year 2000.
Oh, no problem at all. Great.
26 years of retroactivity. So any privacy violation that may have taken place over the last 2.5 decades no longer is applicable because of this legislation.
Is
And if
that
that
not kind of just an admission of guilt right there? Like, oh, shoot, we've
they know
maybe
that
been borking it for 25 years.
Well, they know they're in trouble in the BC case. The BC case basically says that BC privacy law can apply to federal political parties. And political parties have been quite happy with a system whereby no privacy law applies to them, because the two main federal privacy laws that we have, one is the Privacy Act, which applies to the federal government. Political parties are separate from the government. That's not the government. So the Privacy Act doesn't apply there. The other is PIPEDA, the private sector privacy law, which applies to commercial organizations, and the political parties fall through the cracks there as well because they are not technically a commercial organization in the same way, although they certainly have some indicia that one might say they may function that way in some respects. But Privacy Commissioner said, no, that doesn't apply either. And so the parties have been very happy with a system whereby no real laws apply other than the Elections Act, which includes a few provisions that talk about some amount of transparency with respect to people's privacy, but don't establish the same kinds of standards that you would typically see elsewhere. And so the government sticks this into the government sticks this into C4 at the very end. They don't even mention it when they put forward the bill. They proceed to try to put this through in the House of Commons at the committee level, where they spend a total of 30 seconds discussing the privacy elements at committee on this bill. They refuse every request, and there were multiple requests to appear before the committee to talk about the privacy elements. They say, no, we are not interested in any of that. Literally just 30 seconds to say that this is in the bill. And now it's, as we could talk about, has gone to the Senate, and the question is whether or not the government is just going to push this through now over some objections of the Senate itself, which actually did take the time to take a closer look at what all of this might mean.
So the Senate is doing its job. Thank you, the Senate of Canada. Look, here's a question. I just want to ground this, what this actually means. So would the types of things that they would be getting away with that they wouldn't get away with under other types of legislation be example, like list sharing, for example? We know that list sharing in political domains is absolutely rampant, even though it's technically not allowed. Let me tell you that I could make some very inappropriate metaphors about how widely political lists are shared.
Yeah.
So would that be an example? Would there be other examples about privacy norms that have become established in political circles that would not be considered acceptable in either commercial or government contexts?
Yeah, so I'll try to answer this in a couple of ways. First, I'll say that essentially what the legislation does do is say you've got to have a privacy policy. Doesn't say what you have to do for the most part in that privacy policy, but you've got to have one. So, I mean, the short answer to your question is if the privacy policy says that you can do it, then you can do it. And, the government has said, well, we need some common standards, but effectively, they're not creating common standard at all because they're basically leaving to each party to establish whatever they want in their privacy policy by and large. And so you end up with the parties deciding for themselves what they are comfortable with in terms of collection, use, and potential disclosure of personal information. Now, I should note that this is really at least the second attempt to deal with this. There was another bill, Bill C-65, back in the last parliament that sought to deal with this, and it didn't pass. But it actually did have some stronger provisions in there. It wasn't good, but it was less bad than this one because, so for example, so you asked what are some of the kinds of things you can envision. The other one involved things like security breach disclosure requirements. So what happens if you have people's information and you're subject to a breach? The other legislation talked about having to disclose that so that people are aware of it. This legislation doesn't make that a requirement. The other legislation created prohibitions on selling your data. So on the prospect that you could take those lists and potentially sell them to others, that prohibition is now out in C4. So they've gone from putting it in a bill about the Elections Act, which is nominally the right place to put it, to now putting it in a bill about tax policy not wanting to discuss it, making it retroactive, and weakening the already weak provisions that were there.
Well, Michael, just remember, rules are only for bad people.
Well, they're certainly not for political parties, I'll tell you that much.
Fair
You can leave it to decide whether or not
Political
they're bad
parties
people or not.
They're on the side of the angels, so
Yeah.
don't worry, we can definitely trust them.
Well,
Rule-
you should know, Jen, that the sort of part of the debate by senators that sought to defend this was to argue that, our democracy is at stake, that political parties are essential to democracy. And so they need this kind of information to be able to function. So we ought not to be using these rules to constrain what they're doing.
Rules are for thee, not for me, sir.
Absolutely.
For thee and not for me.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us on the line. I really do hope to have you again soon. And we shall stay in touch and stay with our eyes to the prize on Canada's digital policy. Do check us out, www.readtheline.ca. And if you have not already, please do like and subscribe. It helps the channel so much. Thanks again. And I'm Jen Gerson, and this was Michael Geist on the Line.